Let's think think out loud as a group together for the aid of those who haven't been here all semester. I want to think about, we've been looking at faith, and we've sort of categorized some categories of results of faith. So when we've been looking at these different Old Testament figures from Hebrews 11, what has been evident in their lives because of their faith? Can you give me a couple of categories? Like some of them trusted God enough that they trusted and, what's the old hymn name, right? Okay, I knew somebody would know the hymn. So we've seen obedience. A couple of them in the list of Hebrews 11, it was mentioned that they walked with God. So how would we put that? What's another way to put that? If you have a walk with God, what's that mean? Okay, so there are the relational elements. And I want you to think in particular about the promises to Abraham and then how long it took, and some of the promises to Noah and how long it took. So they had faith over, what would we say? Persevering faith was the other way. So I want you to think about these for a second. In this passage, God highlights the faith, but then also talks about the results. We can mess up the order, all right? We can conclude that it's our obedience that makes us right with God, okay? Or we might say, well, how do we relate to God? What are some of the things you do to have a relationship with God? You might pray. On Sunday, you might go to church. You might sing. You might read the Bible. There are different ways of relating. Could somebody spend time praying, reading the Bible, going to church, but not have faith? Absolutely. I mean, you can obey certain things to try to be right with God. You can do certain relational things to try to be right with God. The reason that the chapter focuses so much on faith is because faith is supposed to come first. Faith is supposed to be the link that makes our obedience genuine, because it then comes from the heart. It's a desire to love God. It's a desire to have that relationship. If we have faith and then we're praying and then we're reading and then we're talking with God and going to church and so on, that's the order. Some of you may be familiar with Ephesians 2, where in verse 8 it says, "For by grace you've been saved through" what? Faith. And then it specifically says that it's not of works, okay, lest anyone should boast. So the faith and the grace are what makes us right with God. But then that passage goes on and says we're His workmanship. We've been created for good deeds or good works that God's prepared for us from before the foundation of the world. So the results come from the faith. So don't get the order out of order when you read any of these passages. What we're looking for first is to be made right with God through faith in Jesus Christ, who lived righteously, died in our place, credits His righteousness to us when we believe, and then empowers us by His Holy Spirit. Okay, we want the order right. We want to understand the gospel. We want to understand where obedience fits in, where relationship fits in, and so on. All right, well, let's read the review verses. Somebody read the little section at the top that shows us what we talked about last week, Hebrews 11, 1 and 2, and verse 23. Don't everybody volunteer at once, please. Thank you.
Now faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen. For by this our ancestors were approved. By faith Moses, after he was born, was hidden by his parents for 3 months, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they didn't fear him.
All right, so last week we really focused upon how faith can help us when there are situations where we could fear, okay? And what are situations that regular old college students run into on a consistent basis where you might give in to fear in such a way that it causes you to make the wrong decision, if you stick to faith, you might make the right decision. What are some of the regular old...
Overwhelming homework.
Okay. So because you have overwhelming homework, you have overwhelming fear instead of faith, what can overwhelming homework cause us to do that's wrong?
Drop out.
Okay, we might quit. I hope not. I don't think we've ever knowingly had somebody do that, but it, it does happen on college campuses every day.
Not go to church on Sunday.
Okay, skip other good things that we ought to do because the temptation's there just to work. Yeah, Linda? Yeah, there's the temptation to cheat. There is the temptation to take out our fears and frustrations on everybody around us. I am in pain, and I'm going to take you down too, right? And that's usually with our family or our closest friends. We still put on the church face when we come to Bible study, but you know what I'm saying? All right, so understand that there's direct application to the passage that we looked at last week and the decisions that we make to see our God as big. So what about God makes God worth trusting, worth having faith in? What do you know about God that ought to fuel you and help you to have faith instead of fear? Okay, that's the key. Sometimes we can be tempted to compare our stories to somebody else's stories. Or we can be tempted to compare our story to the story we thought we were going to have, okay? Or our story to the story we wish we would have. And the temptation is to forget that God actually loves us. And so even if the situation we're in doesn't feel very loving, he does love us. What else? What else about God helps to build that faith? Go ahead. Give us another one. Sovereignty. That means he's the king and he rules only. When an earthly king wants to rule, they still can't always make things go exactly like they want, but the king of the universe can do whatever he wants. And he doesn't share much of your plan with you except usually the next step. Okay, the next step. He promises that if you ask for wisdom, he will give it to you. So that's the next step. He doesn't usually, if he told you everything that some of you were asking Mary how she got to Cleveland, earlier. A couple of you were asking that. I don't know how she would answer this, but if I told you my story of how I got to Cleveland, there are times where I'm tempted to say, what in the world am I doing in Cleveland? Right? And if I had known everything that would happen by coming to Cleveland, maybe I would have gotten chicken and said, no, not going to do all that. We don't know. But God can be trusted with the plan. Just a couple more. Anybody else have something that really sticks out to you? Yeah. I mean, we've been looking at one promise after the other to one individual after the other, and the focus has been he keeps them all. Okay. I'll take one more if somebody's just burning to help us review. All right, good. God's big. God's worth it. God can be trusted. And so last week we looked at part of this account of Moses. His parents did not give in to fear. They feared God more than they feared the Pharaoh. We looked at some of the verses from Genesis where the midwives did the same thing when they were delivering the babies. And we looked at that. And so Moses is growing up where? If you remember the story from last week. Who's raising him? Yeah, he was raised for a little bit. Remember how God orchestrated it, that his sister was watching over the baby in the basket, in the water, and Pharaoh's daughter comes down and takes the baby and says, says to the girl, hey, take this to somebody who will take care of the baby. You remember how that all worked out. So the parents got some time with Moses, but then eventually Moses makes his way into Pharaoh's court, which means how is that going to be different than being trained in a Jewish home, a Hebrew home? What's Moses going to hear about in Pharaoh's court instead of what he was hearing about however old he was at home? Yeah, pantheon of all the Egyptian gods versus the true God of the universe. Occult-like practices. There were different ways that the Egyptians used magic and tried to rely upon these false gods to bring about the miraculous, as we see later in the Exodus account. But he's also going to grow up with probably the ability to learn languages. He's going to grow up with the best education he could get. He's going to be in the center of power. He's going to have privilege. He's going to have possessions. Like there's not, from a earthly getting ahead in life standpoint, Moses has hit the jackpot, right? Well, let's look at how that works out in his life. So Hebrews 11:24-27. What does the author of Hebrews point to? Because it starts off by faith. Moses does something by faith. What does he do? Somebody read us verses 24-27, please.
By faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, and chose to suffer with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasure of sin. For he considered reproach for the sake of Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, since he was looking ahead to the reward. By faith he left Egypt behind, not being afraid of the king's anger, for Moses persevered as one who sees him who is invisible.
All right, so verse 24, there is a point in time where Moses is faced with a choice. He could greatly fear the Pharaoh and greatly look to the riches that the Pharaoh could provide him, or he could identify with God's people, identify with God, and it says he made a choice. It was a choice stemming from his faith. He believed that God was real. He believed that God's plan for the Hebrew people was real. And he made a choice of which team he was going to identify with. Okay, so, it's like there maybe not all of you are sportsmen, but there are people in Cleveland who actually take the disdainful position of wearing a Golden State Warriors shirt. Okay, because after LeBron left, Golden State was good, Cleveland wasn't. But as for me and my household, we keep wearing our Cleveland shirts, right? Right, Nate? And my poor mother doesn't know a lot about sports, so some of us in our household were watching the Golden State and Cavaliers game the other night, and we were just loving the fact that the Cavaliers were just smoking them, doubling their points, beating up on my... And my mother comes in and she thought we were being mean, and she felt like we should feel sorry for the Warriors, and I couldn't do it. But why? Because you identify with your team, right? And that's what Moses was doing. Moses was identifying with God's people because of his faith. In verse 25, notice the choice, it says, was going to cause, what's the S word there? He's going to suffer, right? There's going to be some suffering involved. There's going to be some pain involved. There's going to be some sacrifice involved. And what he's giving up is the fleeting pleasures of sin. If Moses had stuck with the gods of Egypt, if Moses had stuck with the Pharaoh's team, he would have had possessions and power and whatever he wanted. Okay, probably, we could go down a list. And I think this is interesting. He considered reproach for the sake of Christ. Did Moses even know who Christ was at that point? No, but I love how the author of Scripture sees identification with God's plan in the Old Testament, puts you on Christ's team even when you were before Christ. All right, what he's saying here is because God had promised many, many times in the passages that we've already looked at that by preserving the Hebrew people, who was eventually going to come as a descendant from those Hebrew people? It was Christ. All right. And so by identifying with the plan of God, he is on, again, that right pathway that God has promised. But my favorite part, it does say he persevered. He left Egypt behind and he persevered. It was a persevering faith, but he did so as one who sees him who is invisible. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, where biblical faith is so real to us. Now, it's not like this every day. I wish it was. It's not like this every moment, and that's not because God's less worthy of the faith. It's because we slip and slide away from it. But the reality is, God can be so real to us that it's as if we can physically see him and touch him, even though we can't see him, right? And that's what this is saying. That's the way it was with Moses. God was real to him, and it impacted his choices because his God was a big God. His God was a powerful God. His God was a real God, and he believed. And so, yes, I hope that you are obedient. Yes, I hope that you go to church, and I hope that you pray, and I hope that you read the word and all of those things. But I hope most of all that you understand who God is, and you see the one who is invisible as the only hope that you have. All right, that's the starting point. Well, let's read a little bit of background on this. In Exodus 2, I'll read a couple of these verses. Years later, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his own people and observed their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his people. Looking all around and seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian dead and hid him in the sand. All right. I always find this to be one of the very interesting passages in Scripture, along with another passage where Moses later loses his temper and strikes a rock. And if you're not, you don't know that story, we won't have time to go into it today. But God refers to Moses as the most something of all people. Does anybody know what that missing word is? Humble. And it's interesting to me that there are a couple of occasions where Moses doesn't seem very humble. And that's good news for us because God sees us through the eyes of grace. God sees us through the eyes of what he's doing in us most of the time, even though we mess it up some of the time, right? So Moses is here and he kills the Egyptian. No commentary is given by God on whether that was a good idea for Moses, a bad idea for Moses. Acts 7 gives us a little insight into this. I didn't put it down on your paper, but when Stephen is preaching in Acts 7, right before he gets martyred, right before he gets stoned with stones and killed, he gives us a little insight into Moses. He said, Moses assumed his people would understand that God would give them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. So somehow Moses had come to understand that God had put him in this position not for himself. God had put him in the palace. God had put him into the position of power and influence and education so that he could be used on behalf of his people. All right? But when we get to verses 13 and 14, the next day he went out and he saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you attacking your neighbor?" And what was the response to him? "Who made you a commander and judge over us?" The man replied, "Are you planning to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses became afraid and thought, "What I did is certainly known." When Pharaoh heard about this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. I skip ahead a little bit because you notice the page is really full, so I couldn't put all the verses. And we have the account of Moses coming into contact with some Midianites. So somebody read from 19 until I tell you to stop, where it says they answered. Go ahead.
They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water from us and watered their flock." Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. She gave birth to a son whom he named Gershom. For he said, "I have been a resident alien in a foreign land." After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor. They cried out, and their cry for help because of the difficult labor ascended to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the Israelites, and God knew.
All right, thank you. So Moses has this sense, he has some understanding that he's going to be used in this plan to keep God's promises to the people. But the initial sort of adventure in this arena does not go well. And now he is away from Egypt. He's away from his people. And he is out in another land. He's, we see this, but then we hear that God heard the groaning of the Hebrew people. They finally turned to the right spot. They're crying out to God for deliverance. They're crying out in faith. And it says God remembered his covenant. This is another way of saying God remembered his what? His promises. He remembered his word. He remembered what he had said. Now, does God ever forget his promises? Ever forget? No. But what the author here is doing, what Moses is doing as he wrote this, is he's taking it from our perspective now. He's taking it from the human perspective where they cried out in faith and God responded. Okay? All right, well, let's look down at the bottom and fill out a couple of these, and we'll hit the Exodus 3. Moses had some sense of the coming, what do we call their deliverance from Egypt? What's the book of the Bible called? Exodus is the missing word here. He gave up the position, power, and possessions possible in Egypt to identify is the word I would use, but you could have said suffer, because suffer's in the text, so you get to pick. There's no czardom up here, no dictatorship. His faith led to choices to prioritize what God prioritizes. Okay? So he has some sense of the coming Exodus. He is identifying with his people. His faith led to choices to prioritize what God prioritizes. Let's fill in the second one also. If Old Testament saints made faith-based choices for the sake of Christ, which is what this passage says about Moses, when they had very limited knowledge of the early stages of God's plans, how much more should those of us with the gospel, have faith that leads to godly priorities, even if they involve sacrificial choices. So again, feel the weight of this. This is a real life person. All right. He is in the dream position. It would be like somebody growing up in the roughest section of Cleveland, and suddenly, I don't know, he's living in Beechwood or something. I don't know. You pick the place. He's got the $300,000-$400,000 home when he grew up in a tough neighborhood, and he can have that for life. He is set for life. But he decides to stick with his team. He decides to stick with the God that he believes in. For the sake of Christ, it says, looking ahead to the reward by faith, he left Egypt behind. Okay. Well, let's finish this out. Exodus 3:1. Somebody want to read this section with us? You get the tremendous privilege of reading all the weird big words. And if you mispronounce them, we won't make fun of you. Go ahead.
Meanwhile, Moses was shepherding the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian.
When we skip a few verses, go ahead.
Do not come closer, he said. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy ground.
All right, pause for a second. What did you may remember this account? Moses is out in the wilderness, and he sees something that captures his attention. He sees a burning what? He sees a bush that looks like it's on fire, but it doesn't burn up. And so it captures his attention. And what's happening here is it's God coming to Moses directly. Now go ahead and keep reading.
Then he continued, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people in Egypt, and have heard them crying out because of their oppressors. I know about their sufferings, and I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians, to bring them from that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the territory of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. So because the Israelites' cry for help has come to me, and I have also seen the way of the Egyptians are oppressing them, therefore go. I am sending you to Pharaoh so that you may lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt.
Thank you. There's a couple things to observe in here. It goes back to the covenant. It goes back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, we know that Abraham was living in a land, and God came to him and said, what? Abraham, get up and go. I'm going to take you to a land. He promised him a promised land, and yet Hebrews tells us, did Abraham ever fully possess that land? No, it says he lived in a what? Lived in tents. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were promised this land, this promised land that's going to flow with milk and honey, and yet they never fully possessed it. But yet, Moses knows those stories. He knows that God was faithful to Abraham. He knows that God was faithful to Isaac. He knows that God was faithful to Jacob. One of the reasons that we study the scriptures and we read about other people is because it shows us that God keeps his what? Promises, so that we remember that too. So notice that in there. Notice also, and this is a notion that maybe you've never thought about. God has a much bigger story than you and me. Okay? The story is God is returning his world, his creation, to better than how he originally made it. Like it's back to his original purposes, where it was supposed to be a splendid paradise for human beings that he loved, all right? Only as he restores it, we won't be able to mess it up again. That's why I say it's better than it was before. He's restoring the world. He's reconciling us to him through the cross, and yet all these individual stories matter. Like God still saw Moses. God still saw Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He still cared about the stuff that mattered to them. He cares about a math 540 something test, whatever that is, right? I don't know what that math kind of stuff is, but he cares about it. God cares about our colds and our fingernails, and although that one did get me, and everything else that we've brought up today. God cares about it all because he connects your story to his big story. He sees you in the midst of that. He cares about you at the same time that he's going to fulfill the promises and the purposes that he's intended to fulfill. And then notice, what does God love? When did he respond in real time in this passage? When they finally did what? Cried out. All right? Maybe you're going through a period of life right now where you just feel like the pressures are just loading up on you, or the bad stuff's loading up on you. Circumstances just are not in your favor, or maybe you're facing decisions and you don't know what to do. And his word says in the book of James, if we lack wisdom, we should finally cry out. It's the same idea. We should finally cry out to him and say, God, give me wisdom. And it says he loves to answer, okay? If anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask God. And it says God gives how? Generously, without finding fault. He loves to answer prayer. So down at the bottom here, and then we'll take the last 3 minutes and let you respond. Moses had to have a deep sense of who God was and what God was like to carry him through the many years of service and trials that were coming until God fulfilled his promises of a promised land. And we said Hebrews 11:27 speaks of perseverance. Perseverance. Moses persevered. So, all right, we quit right at 12:15, but that gives you 2.5 minutes to give us your insights, your questions, your applications. How does this help, if it does? Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. Yeah.
I actually missed last week's Bible study because of the temptation of I just needed to study.
Yeah.
Just needed to do all that. I'm glad that I came here today, even though I'm tested.
Yeah. Now let me say for the record, we were not saying that every time you're faced with that choice, it's automatically a sin if you study instead of coming to Bible study. But how are we characterized, right? So yeah, others. But thank you for sharing that. Anybody else? Yeah.
I mean, I've been like really stressed with like my degree path recently, and so like I feel like a lot of times throughout the past few months, I've been like asking God, like, hey, if I'm on the right path, can you just give me like signs and stuff, or like, just let me know like that comfort like within me and stuff. And it was actually really interesting because this morning the TESOL director came into my education class and lectured us and gave me her contact information. So like that was like a moment where I was like, well, what does this even have to do with diversity in education right now? Like that's something that was just like in my face. I was just like, oh, okay, so yeah, that's right. So it's kind of nice to like read all these stories or read all the parts of the Bible that have like those promises being fulfilled. You know, it's very comforting to know that like even no matter how lost you feel, like there is always like a purpose or something. You know?
Thank you. Thank you. All right, we're out of time, so let's close in prayer. Lord, drive us to prayer because we believe in you, though you're invisible, that you are right here with us. Help us to have the kind of faith that we see in this passage because you are worth it and because you love to hear us when we cry out. Thank you for your goodness. In Jesus' name, amen.